Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. That was a good one from Will. Everybody else too. Will just stood out. Hope everybody's doing all right this morning. Anybody, well, we're eating oneg here. I guess I could ask if anybody brought cabbage and peas. That was always my dad's thing for this day. I tell you, he used to get on to us. If he called on the 1st of January and we didn't have cabbage and peas on the plate, he would... No, I hope everybody's doing all right. I'm glad to be here. Glad to bring the word today. I'll be out for a few weeks traveling with work, so I appreciate any prayers in the next few weeks, and especially for Melissa, who will be holding down the home front by herself. So, as we open up this morning, I was thinking about. I read a story this morning. I love to read some old war stories and stuff like that, and if you go back and you read about World War II, which I know a lot of you probably have, you'll find a lot of different stories about what we could call unsung heroes, right? People that were in the shadows and they were making things happen when nobody knew about it. And so I read a story this morning. There was a B-17 bomber and they were flying and they got shot. They got hit by some anti-aircraft munitions and nothing happened, right? They got hit, but plane didn't blow up. They were able to go back. They landed safely. And as they would normally, if something happened, a lot of times they would have, dud rounds that would come in and they would still be explosive but didn't detonate upon arrival. But there were 11 of those rounds in the plane. And so when they landed, they took them to the armorer for him to disarm. And the interesting thing was, whenever he went to disarm these rounds, he opened them up and found they weren't armed at all. There was no munitions inside of. There was no explosive inside of these. And out of the 11 that hit the plane, all of them were completely empty except for one. And this one round had a piece of paper in it. And on that piece of paper, it was written in I don't know what the language of the Czechs were, but it was written in their language, and it says, "We can't do much, but we can do this." And the background to the story was the Nazis had taken over their part of their nation, and they had forced them into labor. And so these people were over here creating the munitions for the Nazis, but they weren't arming the bullets here, the missiles. And so they, in that sense, they were doing what they could, even though they couldn't be outspoken about it, even though they would lose their life if they got caught. They were in the shadows in the background, making sure that they were able to save the lives they could. There's a few other stories that I was going to share, but I really love that one because it really speaks to the way that God operates at times as well. And whenever we think about how God is always kind of in the background, regardless of what our personal lives are like, but also when we look at the story of God's entire history with the work of His people, and we mostly could probably think about the Book of Esther, right? And Esther is known as a book that God has never mentioned in. And over the years, over the centuries, there was always a question, is this a divinely inspired book? A book that has no mention of God. God doesn't speak, but it pertains to God's people. And I absolutely love that book because it gives the overwhelming message that even when we think God is not there, He's in the background orchestrating His plan, His will, and His providence for us. When we think about God Himself, the fact that He took upon flesh and He dwelt amongst us, we think about the fact that in the most humble of towns, we think of Bethlehem, and I know there's been a few people that have been to Israel. Even today, Bethlehem is not a small city. It's not the smallest of towns. It's not like driving through Rocky Branch where I live, right? But it's no big metropolis. And even more so at the time that Yeshua was born, it was probably less than Rocky Branch. It was a very, very small town. And when we get into the story, the narrative of the birth of the Messiah, and we kind of have all of these things that we talk about that aren't necessarily the same as what our tradition teaches, right? One of those is that He was born basically in the backyard of a hotel in a town that would have never had one, right? It was that small. This was no big traveling center. This was no segue for multiple travel routes. This was a humble little town. So in this little podunk town of Bethlehem, the Savior of the world, God in flesh, he's born in the most humble of means. And it's so unexpected. It's just exactly like the Book of Esther. In the midst of complete chaos in Israel, where the Romans have taken over and Caesar is God, and you've got all of these other rulers dictating what all of God's people can do, the one who is going to come, the true King of Israel, is born in the most humble of ways. And when we think about that, we think about, what does that mean? Why did God do that? What is it for God to be born in such a way? I'm drawn this morning to him dwelling amongst us, and the fact that he was born in that humble scenario and he grew up amidst the people of Israel, but in a way that practically no one saw it coming. He was able to, at the time of that was appointed for him to come on the scene, he was a part of the people. He was there. He had been there all along. He had been there for 30 years. And as the title says today, and he pitched his tent and dwelt among us, I'm sure most of you can understand where I'm coming from. It's John chapter 1. And we'll read it, and it's not just John chapter 1:14, the whole first chapter of the book. We're not reading the whole first chapter, but the whole first chapter is very important. It really pours into this central verse that I think is highlighting what it's trying to tell us. But we'll start in verse 9. It says, "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him." He so humbly came, and he was raised up in the midst of the people in the world that they didn't recognize him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of natural descent, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. The Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. And we love this passage, right, in our denomination. We love this passage because the English version, I'm reading the CSB, says the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. But we all know that word is something a little bit different, right? That word in the Greek is a very specific word that means that he pitched his tent. Or if we can add a little verbal connotation to an Old Testament noun, he tabernacled amongst us. And we love that because we try to portray Yeshua as being born on the Feast of Tabernacles. And I don't want to start a big debate today, but I don't necessarily know that that's the case, nor do I think it's important to know. I think that whenever we make this passage mean a proof text of trying to pinpoint the exact day that the Messiah was born, we lose sight of the importance of what this verse is trying to tell us. This was a very specific word. And I've seen a lot of scholars, they grab a hold of this word and they acknowledge the word, but then on the other side, some of them really try to dismiss it. No, that could really just mean he dwelt amongst us. No, this is a very, very specific word. And if you know the Gospel of John, you know that John has no words that are misplaced or arbitrary. He is very specifically telling us theological points through the words that he's using. And his gospel, above all the others, is the most symbolic gospel there is. So when John uses this word that is really out of the normal use of trying to tell that someone is amongst other people, we know that that is truly trying to teach us something. I'm just not so sure or convinced that it's trying to tell us that Jesus was born on the first day of Tabernacles. When we look at the original intent of God and what God expected or what God wanted from creation, we look back at the beginning and we see that he created man and woman so that they would bear his image. We've talked about this a few weeks ago, that they would rule and reign over creation, but then he placed them in a garden so that he could dwell amongst them. It doesn't say there's a tent in the garden, but he put them in the garden so that not only they could be there and do the will of the Father, but that the Father could walk amongst them. It's interesting that it doesn't mention him walking until after they've partaken of the forbidden fruit, but in that moment they hear his footsteps, if God has them, and they hide. And I think that we should focus on the part where they hide and really look at why they came to this place where they would hide from God, but also we have to acknowledge that they were going against what God intended. He wanted them to be in communion with him always. God's intent from the beginning was that he would be in the midst of his people and that his people would be in the midst of him. When we look at the tabernacle, there's an old kind of Jewish theology that says that creation wasn't completed until the tabernacle was built. Now, I disagree with this because creation was completed in the beginning. The tabernacle had to be built because of the sin of man. But I also look at the importance of what they're saying, because if you read Exodus 39 and 40, and we'll get there through our portion, you see so much creative language there when God is revealing the building of the tabernacle. Exodus 39 and 40 uses specific language so that whenever we're reading this creation of the tabernacle, we should be thinking back to the Garden of Eden. This tabernacle, after all, was a form of a mini Garden Eden that God now placed in the midst of his people, finding his way to come back and do what he intended from the beginning, which was to dwell in the midst of their presence. When we look at this word in John 1:14, and it says that he tabernacled amongst us, I would say that it more specifically is pointing to that moment where God said, pitch this tent and I will dwell in the midst of our people. I would more link what John is saying in chapter 1 verse 14 to Leviticus 26, 11 and 12 when he says, I will place my tabernacle amongst you and I will not reject you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. If I could really pick one verse that I think that John is truly thinking about when he uses this single word, well, that's two verses. I would choose those two verses. Because in essence, if we really think about the entirety of the ministry of Yeshua, what more was he doing than exactly that? What more was going on with the birth and the advent of Christ than him, God himself, coming and dwelling amongst his people, saying, I will not reject you even though you reject me. I will not reject you even though your brothers and your sisters try to keep you away from my presence. I will not reject you. Even though you who come from the nations, who come in accordance with the covenant of Abraham to come and draw near to the God of the universe, but my people have blocked your path, I will not reject you. When we look at Exodus, and we're looking earlier than the passage there, but we're looking in chapter 29, verses 43 through 46. He's speaking of the tabernacle here, and he says, I will also meet with the Israelites there, the tabernacle, and that place will be consecrated by my glory. I will consecrate the tent of meeting and the altar. I will also consecrate Aaron and his sons to serve as a priest. I will dwell amongst the Israelites and be their God, and they will know that I am the Lord, their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, so that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord, their God. Here he talks about not just the tabernacle, but the priests and all of the accoutrements that go into the tabernacle all have to be consecrated. And what does it mean? What's the method of consecrating these things? We find it later on. It's the anointing of oil, right? It's this process and this ceremony that God dictates and says, anoint these things with oil so that they will be consecrated, set apart. And when we look at that, there's no real magical sense of oil there, but it's God's method to say, these things belong to me. Whenever He's anointing something, it belongs to me. He even anoints the people of God at the beginning whenever they're standing before Him for the first time. And He says, all of these things belong to me. Interestingly enough, the word Mashiach means the anointed one. In the tabernacle itself, we see this picture of God foreshadowing the presence of God in the form of Yeshua as He would come, the anointed one, the Messiah of all the people. And this tabernacle would follow them or go with them, and it would be in its midst. And it's very important to understand that when God delivered His people out of Egypt, that He went before them in a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of light by night. But once He got to a place and says, build this tabernacle, pitch my tent amongst my people, no longer was He now out in front of them, but He was where He originally intended, right in the middle. And that could be kind of uncomfortable for some or very comfortable for others, depending on where your heart is with God. That's why I love my beautiful wife. She loves my collection of Bibles. But I love that because I think about my grandmother growing up, and she had a Bible in every single room. She had pictures on the wall that talked about Jesus. She had little angel figurines. She had a spoon collection that had all kinds of angels on them, right? In every single room of her house, she had these reminders of God, and those reminders could be good or they could be bad, right? Imagine being in the presence of Israel, wandering through the wilderness, and your heart's not right, but every single day you have to look at the presence of God that's right there in the midst of your community. Sometimes we talk about church buildings and how they look, but when you go and you research the history of churches and why they built these tall spires that look differently in the beginning of American history than they do now, they wanted them to be the most prominent building in the center of their community. They wanted to make sure that people were reminded that God should be in their midst and always be reminded of following Him. So God has this tabernacle, and it's very important to understand this tabernacle in contrast to the rest of the world around Israel at that time. We often view, and it definitely was a punishment, that the people of Israel had to wander in the desert for 40 years, right? But a curse can also be a blessing. Because it wasn't that God cursed them and said, you must walk in the wilderness all these years, you've got to walk around and never inherit the promise. He didn't do that and say, I'm going to go park over here where I belong in Jerusalem. Now, when y'all are done wandering 40 years, come see me. That's what all the other nations would do, right? Every other nation had their temple, their structure that wasn't going to move, and if you wanted to be in the midst of their deities, you had to go before them wherever they were. Not our God. God says, you have some consequences to your sins, but guess what? I'm going to be in the midst of you. My presence seeks to dwell with you. I find it interesting, this verse in here in 29, he's speaking of the tabernacle, and it's being in the midst of them, but the language is almost as if he wants to do exactly what he did in the garden, which is dwell amongst his people. And when you read through the Torah and you read through the wilderness experience, that language is inescapable. His tabernacle is there, right? And the Holy of Holies is there. And the offerings happen and people come before Him. But this language is inescapable throughout the Torah, where it appears as if God is, even though it says He's confined to this place, this Holy of Holies, it's as if He's not. It's as if His presence is permeating throughout the entire community of Israel. He is doing what He intended from the beginning, which was to walk amongst His people in a garden. Now later on, we get to Samuel, and I love the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. I've given several messages recently out of those two books, studied it for a good time over the summer. But there's a striking resemblance to the beginning of Samuel as there is to the beginning of our Messiah. We have this woman who's barren, who can't have a child, who gives birth to a child who's dedicated to to the service of the Lord, who grows up, by the way, in the tabernacle of the Lord, and goes on to lead his people, Samuel. And so we kind of have this same humble beginnings to the book of Samuel, but we get towards the end in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and this is the place where David's going to say that he wants to build God a temple. And we're just going to read the first 7 verses. He says, "When the king had settled into his palace, and the Lord had given him rest on every side from all of his enemies, the king said to the prophet Nathan, 'Look, I am living in a cedar house, while the ark of God sits inside a tent, inside tent curtains.'" Now, this isn't an unreasonable plea for David, right? I mean, he has a palace in the city of David. He's living life in good and peace because of the Lord. And he says, how is it that I should have this palace, but God dwells in a tent? And so he tells him, he says, so Nathan said, "Go, excuse me, go and do all that is on your mind, for the Lord is with you." Now, this is what Nathan says as Matt Nappier would probably say, right? If you came before me, if David came before me and said, "Hey, look, I live in this great mansion. God's living in a tent. I think I should build God a tent," I'd say that's probably an honorable assessment. Go ahead. You know, if that's what you think you should do, that's probably good. And so Nathan here, it's not that his lack of his office of prophecy right here is in play. He just simply responds just like most of us would to something like that. And we have things all the time where people say, "Well, I think I should do this for God." At face value, I'll tell you, if you think you should do it, go ahead, right? That's what you should be doing. But Nathan, after that, he goes before the Lord as the prophet he is, and he knows he should. He says, "But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan and said, 'Go to my servant David and say, this is what the Lord has said. Are you to build me a house to dwell in? From the time I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until today, I have not dwelt in a house. Instead, I have been moving around with a tent as my dwelling. In all of my journeys with the Israelites, have I ever spoken a word to one of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to keep shepherd of my people Israel, saying, why haven't you built me a house of cedar?'" God's response to David's desire to build him a house is, "Why do you think I need a house?" And I love this passage because it's the humility of God. And we think about Philippians 2. It's kind of been a chapter I've gone through over and over this year, more than I ever have, of the humility of Yeshua to take upon flesh, to give up the glory that he was deserved, and to come and serve his people. Here we see that same humility in God's response to David when he says, "Who told you that I needed a house?" And I love that response. I've always focused on the humility of God here in this moment, but we also need to focus on the fact that he basically says, "I am completely content in a tent because I can follow my people. I am completely content living in my tabernacle because in all the history of Israel, I have been able to dwell amongst them." In this moment, God says, if you build me a house, it's going to be stationary. If you build me a house, I no longer will be able to move about in this tabernacle with my people. Later on in Exodus 37, the prophet Ezekiel reiterates the same message that Leviticus and Exodus, these passages that we've read already. He says, "My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people." I will be with God, and they will be my people. This is what he's telling to Ezekiel in Ezekiel 37, and this comes after 36 chapters of talking about the history of Israel. And he's already discussed the sinful ways that Israel has worshiped them. He's already discussed the fact that he's removed his presence from the temple before it was destroyed. He's talked about all of the wicked ways in which they served other gods in his house. But he says, I will be their people in chapter 37. This comes after 36 and 37. He's talking about renewing his people, and we love those chapters. I love them anyway. Chapter 36, when he's talking about, I will give them my spirit, and they will be able to walk and follow me in the ways that I desire. In 37, we have this waking up, this resurrection of dead bones, of people who have gone to battle and lost, and God raises them from the dead, and he says, I will be their God, and they will be my people. Later on, and speaking of things that I think we misrepresent sometimes, later on in chapters 40 through 45, we have this temple vision where God, or at least the angel of the Lord, brings Ezekiel up into this vision, and he says, behold this temple. And he measures it. It says he brings out a measuring rod, and he measures every single inch of this temple. And we can find depictions of it, right? You can go buy models of this Ezekiel's temple. But there's one thing that's completely missing from Ezekiel that would not allow us to ever be able to construct exactly what they're talking about. And it's the walls. And all of the measurements of the floors and the different rooms and the doors, all of these measurements that go into chapters of describing this temple to Ezekiel, there's one important piece missing, and it's walls. In the description given to Ezekiel, we have a temple that has a floor plan. He even describes the measurements of the roof, but there are no walls. It's as if this roof was just floating above this floor plan. And what's the purpose of a floor plan, Will, if you have no walls to show what the plan was supposed to be, right? And we have to ask ourselves, what was Ezekiel doing? What was God showing him if he's giving him a temple that cannot be constructed? When we look at the historical context of Ezekiel, we can see that this vision, this oracle that's given to Ezekiel, it's given in between the time that the first temple was destructed and the second temple was built. And we kind of have a big movement and multiple denominations of the third temple to be built, and it's based off of this Ezekiel temple that's given, but there's one problem with that. If the intention of God was to build this temple that he gives a vision to Ezekiel, why didn't they build it when they built the second temple? There is no mention anywhere else in the Old Testament scriptures of them saying, well, here's what God said to Ezekiel. No, I think I'll go with this plan over here. There's no mention of that. The people of Israel never at one point thought that that was the plan of the temple that they should move forward with when God delivered them. So it begs the question, what was the purpose? Short answer, because I can't go into it today, the long answer. But short answer, this is apocalyptic language that's used throughout Ezekiel where an angel's bringing him. We have it in chapter 1 where it talks about this flaming throne of God that's flying through the sky. We have apocalyptic language in chapters 8 through 11 where he's telling him and showing him the horrible sins of the people and what they've done to God's house. For me, understanding Ezekiel a little bit better, what he's trying to tell the people is, you shut the doors of God's house and you did the things that you wanted to do. Read chapters 8 and chapter 9. It shows the priest of God going into his house and offering sacrifice to other gods. It shows the priest going into his house, turning their back on him and bowing to the sun and worshiping it. And Ezekiel presents this beautiful, angelic picture of this marvelous temple that has no walls to show them that the entire point of God's house being in your midst was that God's light would be able to shine forever outside of its walls. God didn't place his house here so that you could do with what you want with it. He placed it here so that you would draw near to him, to know him better, to represent his character in the world, and that the light that shone only in that Holy of Holies would actually shine beyond that to the world, and that others would want to come and have fellowship with God too. It's really kind of prodding Israel and saying, if you wouldn't have messed up, this is what could have been. If you would not have done your own thing in your own ways, the glory of God would have gone out well beyond where the walls were in this temple. When we read Zechariah chapter 2, we see similar language to that of Ezekiel. And Zechariah is another apocalyptic type of literature, right? But we'll just read chapter 2. It's short. It's just 12 verses. But he's talking about not the temple here, but he's talking about Jerusalem. And he says, I looked and I saw a man with a measuring line in his hand. The same language we find at the end of Ezekiel. And I asked, where are you going? And he answered me, to measure Jerusalem, to determine its width and its length. And the angel who was speaking with me went out. And another angel went out to meet him. And he said to him, run and tell this young man, Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls, because of the number of people and the animals in it. The declaration of the Lord, I myself will be a wall of fire around it, and I will be the glory within it. Listen, listen, flee from the land of the north. This is the Lord's declaration, for I have scattered you like the four winds of heaven. This is the Lord's declaration. Listen, Zion. Escape, you who are living with daughter Babylon. For the Lord of the armies says this, in pursuit of his glory, he sent me against the nations, plundering you. For whoever touches you touches the pupil of my eye. For look, I am raising my hand against them, and they will become plunder for their own servants. Then you will know that the Lord of armies has sent me. Daughter Zion, shout for joy and be glad, for I am coming to dwell among you. This is the Lord's declaration. Many nations will join themselves to the Lord on that day and become my people. I will dwell among you, and you will know that the Lord of armies has sent me to you. The Lord will take possession of Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and he will once again choose Jerusalem. Let all humanity be silent before the Lord, for from the holy dwelling he has roused himself. This is a beautiful chapter, but most notably, and you can understand why I went to this chapter after Ezekiel, here in the prophet Zechariah, the measuring rod is not used for the temple itself, but used for the entire city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is given as a city without walls, because the nations will flood the city running towards God whenever he establishes his glory back on earth, that they will run towards him in a way that the walls can't contain. That they will come to him, and he speaks of all the nations here. It's not just the people of God who were born Jewish or born within Israel, who were just like we do today, you're born a Baptist, right? It's not just those people in Israel at that time who were born to a family that lived in Jerusalem or lived in Judah or lived in the northern tribes. He's speaking to the entire world, and Isaiah has this beautiful picture as well of this banquet where the nations run to the banquet and there's food for the entire world. And it's the same thing that's happening here with Zechariah. This city without walls has no walls because the entire world is invited to dwell within it. When we look back at the tabernacle once again and we see what its purpose was and what it was intended to do, you know, we look at the face value and we say that its intention was that people could draw to God to bring him offerings. And if we think about kind of our old Christian ways of thinking about sacrifice, right? Well, the tabernacle was the place we could come and be made new with God when we sinned. That's not the case, right? I mean, you were required to bring an offering to God if you sinned against him. But that was just one of 7 offerings, right? You had Thanksgiving offerings, free will offerings. You had all of these other things. So what is the purpose of the tabernacle? Personally, I think on face value, it was simply that people could draw near to God and eat with God, have a feast with God. And when we understand this concept, we understand that it's looking forward to the banquet that we're to have with God. But also, most importantly, and I wish I could steal the tagline of Bible Project. Anybody listen to them? Bible Project, they have the most simple but genius tagline at the beginning of every show. They say that the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus. And I think that's so simply put, but so perfectly said, because this entire word, if we don't understand that everything from the beginning, from Genesis 1:1, is trying to direct our path towards Jesus, then we have totally missed the purpose. And the tabernacle itself is not exempt from that. We look in John 2, this is where Yeshua says that he would destroy a temple in 3 days. And this is the one gospel where he says, I'm not talking about that building up on a hill. I'm talking about me. You destroy me in 3 days and I will raise him up. Right? He equates himself in that moment to the temple or the dwelling place of God, the place where God meets with humanity. And in that, we kind of see this example of the tabernacle that was pointing to Jesus. It was this place that God wanted to not just be permanently. God didn't want to dwell in the wilderness in a tent permanently. His intention was that he would dwell amongst all people. But how did they get to that place where he was in the wilderness? There was sin, right? And the people were kicked out of the garden. You have all of this language in Genesis that separates people from God. And he comes at a certain point and he says, I'm going to reinitiate this dwelling with mankind. And he delivers the nation of Israel out of the hands of the Egyptians. These people that are in bondage, it's their faith in the blood of the Lamb, by the way, that allows him to free them. He brings them out of bondage. He delivers them through the Red Sea and water. And then he gives them a tabernacle, this picture of the redemption that God intended through Yeshua. This faith, this deliverance, this following God, this renewing of covenants that happens. Remember, the tabernacle held the Ark of the Covenant that, by the way, had multiple things in it, but they were reminded of the covenant that had to be renewed because they broke the first one immediately whenever it came down. Most importantly, this tabernacle, like we said earlier, was at the center of Israel. And when we look at this structure, and you can find all kinds of different writings. Brad Scott, the late Brad Scott, had a good book on the tabernacle and the different significance of the deals, of all the structure there. But I would offer today a few points of where the tabernacle was pointing us to Yeshua. And the very first thing, imagine yourself in the wilderness here, and you're camped at one of the camps around the tabernacle, and you say, I want to go and visit God in His home. I want to bring an offering. He's blessed me out here in the wilderness. I'm alive. I'm blessed. I have breath. He brought me from the grasp of my enemies. I'm going to bring this offering to Him, and we're going to have fellowship. The first thing that you see is what? It's surrounded by a wall, right? This curtain wall surrounds the entire tabernacle. No doubt you could see the tabernacle out the top of it, but it's surrounded by this wall that separates God's presence from the rest of the camp. And when we think about the tabernacle as a miniature Eden, we get that picture of where God placed the cherubim at the doors to Eden and said, you can't come in here anymore. What's most interesting, and I don't think Caleb Hammonds didn't hear any other firefighters, this was a fire hazard, right? There's only one entrance in and out of this place. There's only one way in and out. There's a single door that leads into the presence of God. And if you think that John wasn't being intentional when he said that Yeshua said, I am the door, and all who enter through me will inherit the kingdom of earth, if he wasn't talking about this tabernacle, well, he was. Okay, let's just say he was. No doubt that was what John had in mind. There is only one entrance into the presence of God. There's a single doorway that you would have to go through whenever you were walking into the presence of God. And the first thing you would see after you walked into this doorway was the altar, right? This is the place of sacrifice. This is the place of offering to God. And you're constantly reminded of this concept that to draw near to God requires sacrifice. That in our fallen state, they're both reminded of the presence of God in Eden, but also their absence from Eden because of their own depravity. And so they would see the altar and this this concept that blood is required to draw near to God. Next, you would see this bronze laver, this big, beautiful bronze bowl that held the water that the priests would wash their hands with. And you're definitely thinking about the cleansing through the water. We were talking about Ezekiel 37 a while ago, but just before that, Ezekiel 36, he says, I'm going to place my spirit within you, but he also says, I will sprinkle you with water and you will be cleansed. And we think about all of the times where Yeshua himself is talking about water and the cleansing that would come from him. And later on in John, he says in chapter 7 that those who are thirsty, they'll find rivers of living water that will flow from me. There was that one day in the whole year where water was offered on the altar, and in that moment, Yeshua says those words. Past the bronze laver, you go into the tabernacle itself, right? This is the house of God. And no doubt he built it in such a way that we could relate to it as our own house. We have a front yard. That's where the altar is for him, right? We have our outside. We have our inside. The living room is that inner court, not inner court, the holy place, right? So you would walk in there, and to your left, you would see what? The lampstand, the menorah. You would see this great and big, and this is no like candlestick, right? We have all kinds of menorahs that fit on our tables and stuff every year for different occasions. This was ginormous. This was huge. This was taller than me, which isn't that hard, but it's still a candlestick, right? So you would have this to your left, and again, we're reminded of Eden. This candlestick's not just 7 candlesticks here. It's built, and you go back and read the language. We'll read it through our portions. It's built as a tree. God in his house, he told mankind to take some gold and mold it into a tree. It has buds, it has flowers, all of these things are on it. It represents that tree of life and light that God intended in the garden from the beginning. When he told man, choose this tree and not this one. Choose this tree that gives life, not this tree that will separate you from me. So in there, we have this light, and when we go to Revelation, I find it even more interesting that in chapter 1, I think. Chapter 1, it talks about these 7 churches. And Revelation is very much apocalyptic language. I would not suggest reading it literally, just about at any point. But he talks about these 7 churches, and these churches are lampstands. He takes this language of a menorah. He says that church is a lampstand, so we get it, right? Not literal. But in the midst of the lampstand is the Son of God. The Son of God who dwelt amongst us is seen in the midst of the light of these churches walking amongst his people. Right across from the lampstand, we have the table of showbread, and I really love this. This is really my favorite because on that table of showbread, showbread's kind of a weird word, right? And it's not even S-H-O-W, it's S-H-E-W. It's this old English language. It means bread of the presence. If you look at the Hebrew word specifically, it really means face bread. Well, what is face bread, right? It's the bread of the presence. It's the bread that brings you in front of the presence of God that you could dwell with him. This bread is given so that you would understand that God is the provider of life. And this bread on this table, it's eaten every single week on Shabbat. The priest would eat it. They'd bake more loaves, put them back in there, and it sits all week. Because of the glory of God, it doesn't become stale, right? Well, right next to this table or on the table of showbread, right next to the bread, you had wine and you had spices. You had all of these things that were offered up, right? God offers up frankincense with his showbread. He offers up wine drink to the priests. They would drink the wine during the daily offerings. I find it very little coincidence that in John 6, Jesus says these words that people have struggled to understand for thousands of years when he says, unless you eat of my flesh and you drink of my blood, you cannot inherit the kingdom of earth. And we have this concept of transubstantiation or whatever the long word is, where Catholics believe that when they take the wafer and the shot glass of juice, that's transformed in their mouth as the literal flesh of Jesus. I think that misses the point. But I think we do as well sometimes, right? Because there's no coincidence that when Yeshua sat at the Last Supper And he said, do this in remembrance of me. It doesn't mention anything but bread and wine. It mentions the very things that were on the table of showbread in God's house. It mentions the very things that God said, this is my table and I want to share it with you. In that moment, skipping ahead because I just get so excited about the table of showbread, in that moment, what is Yeshua saying? But these things that you had to travel all over the world to this one place to get, this one place where God dwelt and said, this is my table, God in the flesh now says, take these things and share them with the entire world. God says, my table doesn't need to be confined to this one place. My house doesn't need to have walls. Take this bread and this wine, which is a symbolic picture of fellowship with me in your presence, and take this everywhere. Me and Tommy ate lunch yesterday. We've got a habit of eating lunch every other week now, and we don't necessarily talk about the football games that are coming on or the latest politics, right? I can guarantee you that the majority of what me and Tommy sit down and talk about are things of the Spirit, things that are in our lives that we're dealing with, things that God's leading us to, things we're studying, right? In this world today where we have fast food restaurants and lunchtime and dinner as a hindrance to our daily schedules, we disregard one of the most important things that God gave us as a picture of His presence, and that's sitting down and eating a meal with other people. I was talking with several people over the past couple of weeks about different things, and it seemed like every conversation that came up, we were talking about dinner time. And I made a post if you didn't see it, and all of these people, every single one, it was like 6 or 7 people over 2 weeks, said that they and their family were too busy to eat dinner together. Like ever. I'm not talking about we all get busy, right? And you may have to grab some takeout from time to time. They said their family never ate dinner together. And I don't mean that as a judgment. I'm talking about the society we live in that has gotten us so wound up and busy that we've forgotten to stop and recognize the presence of God amongst us that wants to sit and have a meal. That was the purpose of the tabernacle. That was the purpose of God's presence amongst His people. This wasn't some slaughterhouse to represent the sins of the people, but it was this beautiful picture of God wanting to sit down and dine with His people. He wanted to have a meal. The thing about the temple that was better, I don't want to say better than the tabernacle, but gave more convenience, was that they built all of these rooms on its side at that point. And guess what? 2 of them were on each side, the north and the south. Huge banquet halls. Because when you offered your offering to God, you then came and sat down and ate it. For certain ones. Sin offering, no, I got it. But when you brought a Thanksgiving offering, right? One thing that was beautiful, and I don't think I mentioned it here, but when you brought a Thanksgiving offering to God, which was an offering that said, God, you have blessed me so much, I just want to give you thanks. He said that you had to bring essentially the same offering as the Passover. You brought a lamb before God, you had to slaughter it and cook it. You had to bring 36 or 32, I can't remember the exact number, 30 some odd loaves of bread, right? You had to bring 30 some odd loaves of bread, a whole lamb, and the fixins, okay? This is not your regular Sunday lunch, okay? But the thing about it was, God says you're going to offer it to me, and just like the Passover, you have to eat it before a certain amount of time, or it will not be acceptable for God. Now, even the risers over here, I think they've got the largest family in our congregation, even they would be hard-pressed to consume an entire lamb, 36 loaves of bread, and all the fixins in one meal, right? He said, I don't know, I got some growing boys, right? But what was the purpose here? Why would God say, bring your family, give this offering, and you have to eat it all or I don't accept it? It forces you to share it with others. If you wanted to have a Thanksgiving offering, if you wanted to praise God, God said you don't get to do that alone. You go grab whatever strangers are in Jerusalem, you bring your whole family, whatever it takes to consume this entire meal. I don't want you thanking me alone. I want you to share in this Thanksgiving with as many people as possible. Again, God's presence that's in us wants us to sit and have a meal with Him and have a meal with our others. When we look at the difference here, and I'll just go straight to the Ark of the Covenant inside. What did it contain? It had the throne, right? That's what the Ark of the Covenant was. It was a throne, and we see all these pictures. I almost put up a picture today of the Ark of the Covenant, but I couldn't find one that I was satisfied with, because we always see the cherubim holding their wings straight out like this, right? And I'm always like, when I see those, I'm like, how would anybody ever sit on a throne like that? Right? I couldn't find it this morning, I found some pictures that I felt were accurate depictions where the cherubim sit, but they actually had 4 wings, by the way, not 2, so I don't ever see any with 4 wings. But I saw one that was accurately depicting 1 wing from each behind and the other 2 wings forming a seat, and I thought, well, that's close. That's probably close to what it was. This was a throne. This wasn't just a box to be able to sit in here and store stuff, right? I got plenty of those in my attic, storing stuff I never look at. This was a throne for God. One of the interesting things about the history of the Ark of the Covenant, and it wasn't even there at the time, but just the temple itself, whenever a Greek intruder came in about 100 years before Jesus, and they overtook the temple. It took them months, by the way. The priests were warriors. They fought. People think, the priests were just, monks or something. No, these priests were warriors. It was a fortified place for them to protect the house of God. And they fought for months. They finally overran them. And whenever they went inside, they tried to desecrate the whole temple. And the leader said, no, don't do this. This is their house of worship. But he still looked around, right? And when he peeked around to the Holy of Holies, he wrote back and said, these people are kind of strange. They got this whole big fancy building, this temple, to this God that they worship, a whole nation, and there's not even a God in there. There's nothing. And that's the whole point, right? But his throne represented his righteousness, his kingship. It had tablets of stone in there that had the 10 Commandments, so that people would be reminded of the covenant he made with them that required obedience. It had the manna, a little jar of manna that came from the wilderness, to remind them that God is the provider. He is the one that gives sustenance. He's the one that keeps us alive. And it had the budding rod of Aaron, this picture of God's ability to take things that seemingly have no power, and he can use it to deliver his people. All of those things pointing to Yeshua himself, our King, our deliverer, our sustainer. All of those things pointing forward to that moment where he equates himself to the temple of God. 2 Corinthians 6:16. It takes this language from Leviticus and it says, you, speaking to the believers, speaking to the people of God, he says, you are the temple of the living God. Yeshua has called himself the temple, right? He says, I will be broken down and raised up in 3 days. Here, Paul speaks to the people of God and says, you are the temple of God. Do you not know that the Spirit of God dwells within you? And then he quotes this combination of passages, but Leviticus is definitely in there. He says, God tells them, I will dwell with them and they will be my people. I will be their God and they shall be my people. This concept of the tabernacle saw its reality in Yeshua. Yeshua, God himself, takes upon flesh. He dwells amongst us. He does what he intended to do from the very beginning of time. He walks among his people. He sees a time where God's presence will no longer be symbolized by this building on a hill in Jerusalem, but it'll be symbolized by the people who go out to the nations and break bread with the people around them and share the light and life of God with them. We see this reference one more time towards the end of Scripture in Revelation 21. And the first few verses in Revelation say, then I saw a new heaven, apocalyptic language, right? You're getting used to that every time someone's brought up by an angel and sees it. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I also saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne, "Look, God's dwelling is with humanity. God's dwelling is with humanity, and He will live with them." The same words that are used in John chapter 1 to talk about Him tabernacling, pitching His tent. Here, John equates the coming down of New Jerusalem as God pitching His tent once more, and Jerusalem is seen as that tent. And when we go on, we keep going, He's going to measure Jerusalem just like He does the temple in Ezekiel, just like He does Jerusalem in Zechariah. And lo and behold, this Jerusalem is an exact square. It's a box. Now, who has seen a city that's a box? Right? It's the same amount across, the same amount this way, and the same amount high. I don't know how you make a city that looks like a box, but I'll tell you what else was a box. The Holy of Holies. If you go and you look and you see the measurements of the Holy of Holies, whether it's the tabernacle or the temple, its measurements were exactly the same, breadth, width, and height. What is God telling us here with the New Jerusalem? He's telling us the same thing that He was telling us in Ezekiel chapters 40 through 45, the same thing that He was telling us in Zechariah chapter 2, that God's presence is now here forevermore. The Holy of Holies has now come. This ginormous city that's so bombastic, it looks like it couldn't even fit on the map of Israel itself. His presence is here, and His light will shine forever. By the way, this New Jerusalem that's measured with width and height and breadth, that's all the same, it is like bedazzled, right? Isn't that the word from the old little kit, right? It's like bedazzled. It's got jewels all over it. It's got walls, but its walls are made of glass. Everything that is adorning this New Jerusalem is something that accentuates the light of God. It's something that will take whatever light comes in its midst and project it as far as possible. And that was the intent of God dwelling amongst us, that God's presence, His light, would shine beyond any walls, beyond any borders, that His light would shine throughout all of creation. So what can we take away from this one little verse that says God dwelt amongst us, that He pitched His tent amongst us? I think it's very important for us to realize that He pitched it in the middle, that He placed His presence in the very middle of His people. Whether we're looking at the tabernacle or we're looking at Yeshua Himself, whenever He arrived amongst His brothers in Israel, He placed His tent, He pitched it right in the middle. And that can be definitely uncomfortable, but how many times do we say, yes, God is the center of my life, and then I forget to pray for an entire week? Yes, God is the center of my life. He is number one. He does everything for me. I place Him above everything else in my life, and I don't tell a single person about Him for an entire week. We have to remember that God's dwelling in our midst is so that we can share it with others. We have to remember that sometimes that presence of God can be uncomfortable. And God placed His presence in the midst of a community where Nathan would be next to me in my tent, and he doesn't see me go and visit God for quite a while. And I have to be welcoming to the uncomfortable nature of Nathan coming to me and saying, "Matt, I don't understand why you haven't gone to see God in His house. His presence is right here in our midst." We have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable nature of God in our presence. We have to be willing to fight. God, whenever He brings the people of Israel, He's in their presence. He takes them into the promised land. He doesn't say, "I'm going to fight every battle and you can stay home." He says, "I'm going to fight your battles. I'm going to deliver your enemies into your hands." God promises to go before them into battle, but He doesn't promise to go for them. We have to be willing to fight the battles that come with God being in our presence. The entire world is against everyone in this room right here, if you don't know that already. The entire world wants to see all of us trip and fall and defame the name of God. That's what they're looking for. We have to be willing to fight. We have to be willing to share the presence of God with other people. When we interact with others, whether it's people in this room, our friends at work, our family at home, it should be as if they are experiencing the presence of God. Think about that for a minute. How many of us can say that every interaction I had with someone, they probably experienced that interaction as if they were experiencing the presence of God? I can't raise my hand, right? But think about that for a minute. The whole point of Him putting His Spirit within us is so that we represent Him, so that we will go out amongst the nations to make disciples, to share His bread. And when we don't do that, if we interact with people and they walk away and their thought is not that they just experienced God, then we haven't done what we're supposed to do. Be willing to bring God's table to the nations. That's the whole point of His tabernacle. That's the whole point of His presence amongst us. That's the whole point of all of the analogies and the allegories of the New Testament that relate Jesus, Yeshua, us to the tabernacle, is that we are now, wherever we find ourselves, we are now to share that presence with others. Pray with me. Father, we come before You. We give You thanks for Your Sabbath. We thank You for a fellowship of people that want to come together to worship You, to give You honor and glory, to give You thanks for all that You've given us. We thank You for Your Word that builds us up, encourages us, that shows us Your character, and encourages us to live in that character more and more. We thank You for the ability and the responsibility of representing You on earth. We are Your ambassadors. We thank You for that ability to go forward, to walk in Your paths of righteousness, and to share Your presence with others. We thank You for the provision that You've given us to have a meal today, to fellowship with others, but also to remind us to have meals with others, to settle down, to forget the times of the world that wants us to move on and keep going and rush past everything around us and in our life, to sit, have divine conversations with people over breaking of bread. We thank You for Your humility to take upon flesh, to dwell amongst us, to find Your ultimate throne on the seat of a cross and Your crown of thorns, so that we would learn what service to others looks like, to be willing to lay down our life for the benefit of others, that they may enter Your kingdom. We thank You for all of the servants of Your people who bring everything together here for Your people to come together. We thank You for all that You have given us so that we may meet and move forward. We love You. We bless You. You are our King, our Savior, our shield, our strength, our healer, our Redeemer. We love You. We bless You. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much. Is Miss Becky here? I can't see these lights. Anybody that would want to come forward and pray with people, you can come forward. Nathan and I are up here right now. If you have any prayer that you need, any concerns that you need, if you need to come and pray on your own, we'll have a time here of praise and fellowship and prayer. Just come forward and share that. If you need prayer for healing,